My supervisor told me to ignore the crying in the vents. I should have listened. You know that feeling when you're alone in a massive building at 3 a.m. and every sound seems amplified? That creak of metal expanding. That distant hum of machinery. That crying? Yeah, that crying that shouldn't be there. Now, here's the thing about working night security at a shopping mall. You get used to weird sounds. Air conditioning kicking in. Escalators running their automated maintenance cycles. Even the occasional rat scurrying through the ceiling tiles. But crying? Human crying echoing through the ventilation system? That's different. And if you're sitting there thinking, I'd just call the cops immediately, well, that's exactly what I thought too. Before I learned the truth about the Westfield Gardens Mall. Before I met Officer Marcus Webb. And before I understood why some rules exist for reasons we're not meant to question. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about the things we're told to ignore. The sounds we're supposed to dismiss. The rules that don't make sense until it's too late. If this video helps you understand why some warnings should never be ignored, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Because what I'm about to tell you is a true story, one that ended with 3 dead bodies, a decades-old secret, and the kind of evil that doesn't just disappear when you turn on the lights. This is the story of Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old security guard who worked at the Westfield Gardens Mall in Dayton, Ohio. And it's about what happens when curiosity overrides common sense. Look, I need you to understand something about Marcus before we go any further. He wasn't some reckless kid looking for adventure. He was a former Army medic, honorably discharged after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. The guy had seen real horror, real death. He wasn't the type to spook easily. That's important. Because what happened to him, what he found, it broke him in ways that combat never did. Marcus started working at Westfield Gardens in March of 2019. It was a straightforward gig. Patrol the empty mall from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., check the doors, monitor the security cameras, make sure nothing got stolen or vandalized. Easy money for someone with his background. The mall itself was one of those mid-tier shopping centers built in the late 1980s, 3 floors, about 150 stores, the kind of place that was thriving in the 90s but had been slowly dying ever since Amazon started eating retail alive. By 2019, it was maybe 60% occupied. Lots of empty storefronts with soap-covered windows. Lots of dark corridors. Perfect for someone, or something, to hide. Marcus's supervisor was a man named Donald Reichert, 62 years old. Worked security at that mall for 37 years. The kind of guy who knew every inch of the building, every quirk, every shortcut. On Marcus's first night, Donald walked him through the entire mall. Showed him the patrol routes, the camera blind spots, the loading docks that needed extra attention. Standard orientation stuff. But then, as they were wrapping up around 2 a.m., Donald stopped near the food court. They were standing right beneath one of the large ventilation grates in the ceiling, the kind that's about 3 feet by 2 feet, covered with a metal grill. And that's when Donald said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "You're gonna hear things in this building," Donald said, his voice low, almost mechanical, like he'd given this speech 100 times before. Especially around 3 to 4 a.m. Strange things. Sounds that don't make sense. Marcus nodded, figuring the old man was talking about the usual stuff. Settling foundations, HVAC systems, whatever. But then Donald looked him dead in the eyes and said, "If you hear crying coming from the vents, you ignore it. You don't investigate. You don't call anyone. You finish your patrol, you note it in the log as ventilation noise, and you move on. Understand?" Now you can imagine how that landed. Marcus actually laughed at first, thought maybe Donald was hazing the new guy. Some kind of security guard ghost story tradition. But Donald wasn't laughing. "I'm serious, Webb," he said, using Marcus's last name the way military people do. "This isn't a joke. This isn't a test. If you hear crying in the vents, you walk away. That's the rule. It's been the rule here since 1987, and it's kept people safe. Marcus asked the obvious question, safe from what? And you know what Donald said? From being curious. Then he walked away, leaving Marcus standing there in the dark food court, staring up at that ventilation grate, wondering what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. Here's what most people don't realize about night security work. It's 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror. You spend hours walking the same routes, checking the same doors, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. You start imagining things. That's what Marcus told himself during his first week when he'd hear strange sounds. A distant thump. A metallic scrape. The building settling, right? The HVAC system doing its thing. He didn't hear any crying. Not yet. By his second week, Marcus had the routine down. He'd start his shift by checking the perimeter doors, all 32 of them. Then he'd do a full walkthrough of each floor, starting with the third level and working his way down. Security cameras covered most areas, but there were blind spots, especially in the service corridors and storage areas. Those he had to check in person. The mall at night is a weird place. All those stores designed to feel warm and inviting during the day, they look predatory in the dark. Mannequins that seem to watch you. Reflections that move just a split second after you do. Shadows that are just a bit too deep. Marcus would pass the old arcade on the second floor, one of the few original tenants still operating, and the machines would sometimes flicker to life for no reason. Power surges, Donald said. Happens all the time. He'd walk through the empty department store anchor on the north end, his footsteps echoing across acres of tile floor, and sometimes he'd swear he heard footsteps echoing back. Just acoustics, Donald said. Sound travels weird in big empty spaces. Donald had an explanation for everything. Which is why, on his 14th night, when Marcus finally heard it, the crying, he almost convinced himself it was nothing. It was 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday. Marcus was on the third floor, near what used to be a toy store but had been vacant for 2 years. He was logging a broken security camera in his notebook when he heard it. A child crying. Not like a tantrum or a whine. This was the sound of genuine distress. Sobbing. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and broken. And it was coming from the vent above his head. Marcus froze. He looked up at the metal grate in the ceiling, the same kind Donald had pointed to on his first night. The crying continued, muffled by the metal ducts but unmistakable. A child's voice, maybe 8 or 9 years old, crying like their heart was breaking. Every instinct Marcus had, his medic training, his basic human decency, told him to investigate. There was a kid in trouble. A kid in the ventilation system, which made no sense, but still. You don't ignore that. But then Donald's words echoed in his head. If you hear crying in the vents, you ignore it. Marcus stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only 2 minutes. The crying continued. It didn't stop. It didn't fade. Just constant, heartbroken sobbing echoing through the ducts. He took out his radio to call Donald, who was somewhere on the first floor. His hand was shaking. Then he stopped. You don't call anyone. That's what Donald had said. You don't investigate, you don't call anyone, you just note it and move on. Marcus put the radio away. He took out his notebook and wrote, 3:17 a.m. 3rd floor, North Corridor. Ventilation noise. Continuing patrol. Then he walked away. The crying followed him for 3 more minutes as he moved down the corridor. Then it stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. Marcus didn't sleep well that day. Here's the thing about being told not to ask questions. It just makes you want to ask them more. Marcus was military. He understood following orders, respected the chain of command. But he was also someone who'd spent years saving lives, rushing toward danger while others ran away. Ignoring a crying child, even a sound that might not be a real child, it went against everything he was. So Marcus started digging. During his breaks, he'd search online for information about Westfield Gardens Mall. Looking for accidents, incidents, anything that might explain Donald's weird rule. What he found was sparse. The mall had a pretty boring history. Built in 1986, opened in 1987, typical American shopping center. No major crimes. No famous murders. No reason for ghost stories or paranormal legends. But then Marcus found something interesting in the Dayton Daily News archives. A small article from October 1987, just 6 months after the mall opened. The headline read, "Child goes missing during Halloween event at Westfield Gardens Mall." The article was brief. A 9-year-old girl named Sophie Chen had disappeared during a Halloween trick-or-treat event at the mall. She'd been with her parents one moment, gone the next. Security footage showed her walking toward the food court, then nothing. She vanished. Police searched the entire mall. Brought in dogs. Checked every store, every storage room, every utility closet. Nothing. Sophie Chen was never found. The case went cold within 6 months. Marcus read that article 3 times. A child had disappeared from this mall in 1987. Donald said the rule about ignoring the crying had been in place since 1987. That couldn't be a coincidence. Marcus waited until his next shift to confront Donald. The old man was in the security office, watching the monitors, drinking coffee that smelled like it had been brewed during the Reagan administration. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. Donald didn't look away from the screens. "You heard it?" It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Marcus said. "The crying. 3rd floor, North Corridor. Thursday night. And you walked away." "I did." "Good." Donald finally turned to face him. "Then we don't have a problem." "Actually we do," Marcus said. "Because I found out about Sophie Chen." The change in Donald's expression was instant. His face went pale. His jaw clenched. For a moment, Marcus thought the old man might actually hit him. "You don't know what you're talking about," Donald said quietly. "A 9-year-old girl disappeared from this mall in October 1987. 6 months later, you establish a rule about ignoring crying sounds in the vents. You gonna tell me those aren't connected?" Donald stood up. He was shorter than Marcus by about 4 inches, but in that moment he seemed much larger. Much more dangerous. "Listen to me very carefully, Webb. What happened to Sophie Chen was a tragedy. A terrible, unexplained tragedy that destroyed her family and haunted this mall for years. But it has nothing to do with the sounds you hear at night." "Then what does it have to do with?" Donald moved closer. "It has to do with keeping people safe. With learning from past mistakes. With understanding that some things in this world don't have explanations that make sense to people like you and me. People like, what the hell does that mean? It means you're new here. It means you don't understand what this building is, what it's seen, what's in its bones. And you need to trust that the rules exist for a reason." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. If there's a child trapped somewhere in this building? There isn't. But if there is? There isn't. Donald's voice cracked like a whip. "Jesus Christ, Webb, do you think we haven't looked? Do you think I haven't spent 37 goddamn years wondering? The vents have been inspected 100 times. Every duct, every shaft, every connection. There's nothing in there. Nothing alive." The word, alive, hung in the air like smoke. Marcus swallowed. "Then what is it?" Donald sat back down heavily. Suddenly he looked every one of his 62 years. "I don't know. But I know what happens when people go looking for the source of that sound. And I know that following the rule, ignoring it, walking away, keeps people safe." "What happens?" Marcus pressed. "What happens when people investigate?" Donald looked up at him with eyes that were haunted in a way Marcus recognized. He'd seen that look before on soldiers who'd seen too much combat. The 1,000-yard stare. "They disappear," Donald said. "Just like Sophie." Now you might be thinking Marcus should have quit right then. Found a new job. Got the hell out of that mall. But here's what you need to understand. Marcus had spent 2 years in Afghanistan. He'd treated soldiers with limbs blown off. He'd held dying kids in his arms. He'd seen real evil, the human kind, and he'd survived it. A weird sound in a ventilation system? A ghost story from a traumatized old man? That didn't scare him. Not enough to run anyway. So Marcus kept working, kept doing his patrols, kept ignoring the crying when he heard it, which was now happening almost every night, always between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., always on the third floor. But he also kept investigating. During his breaks, Marcus started exploring the mall's utility areas. The places not on his official patrol route. Maintenance rooms, electrical closets, storage areas that hadn't been opened in years. He was looking for access points to the ventilation system. Ways someone, or something, could get into those ducts. What he found was disturbing in its absence. The HVAC system at Westfield Gardens was relatively simple. The main units were on the roof. The ducts ran through the ceiling space between floors. There were access panels, sure, but they were all sealed, most of them painted over multiple times. For something to be moving through those vents, moving freely enough to be heard in different locations, it would need to be small. Very small. Or not physical at all. Marcus was leaning toward the second option when he heard the crying for the second time in the same night. It was 3:43 a.m. He was on the third floor again, but this time near the east wing. The crying started suddenly right above his head, and it was different this time. It was clearer, louder, and it was saying words. "Help me," the child's voice sobbed. "Please help me. I'm scared. I want my mom." Marcus's blood went cold. This wasn't just crying anymore. This was a direct plea for help. A child begging for assistance. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to respond. But Donald's warning echoed. They disappear. Just like Sophie. Marcus stood there, fists clenched, as the voice continued. "Please. Someone. Anyone. I've been here so long. I'm so cold. Please help me." And then, and this is the detail that Marcus would never forget, the thing that still wakes him up at night, the voice said his name. "Marcus. Please. Marcus, help me." He hadn't introduced himself to anyone on the third floor. He'd barely spoken to anyone in the mall except Donald. His name tag just said, security. Whatever was in those vents knew his name. Marcus ran. Not walked. Ran. Down the corridor, down the escalator, straight to the security office where Donald was monitoring the cameras. The old man took one look at Marcus's face and said, "It spoke to you." Marcus nodded, still breathing hard. Donald closed his eyes. "God damn it." "It's escalating," Donald said quietly. He turned off all the monitors except one. The feed showing the third floor corridor where Marcus had just been. The empty corridor. Nothing there but shadows. "What is?" Marcus demanded. "What the hell is happening in this building?" Donald was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled a key from his pocket, not one of the keys on his security ring, but a separate key on a string around his neck, and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out a folder. The paper yellowed with age. He set it on the desk between them. "What I'm about to tell you," Donald said, "doesn't leave this room. You don't write about it. You don't tell your friends. You sure as hell don't post about it online. Understand?" Marcus nodded. "Sophie Chin didn't just disappear," Donald began. "She was taken. Taken by someone who worked in this mall. A janitor named Raymond Cook." The folder contained police reports, crime scene photos, newspaper clippings that had never been published. Cook had a utility closet on the third floor where he kept his cleaning supplies, Donald continued. It connected to the ventilation system through an access panel he'd modified. He'd been using it for months, crawling through the ducts, watching people through the ceiling grates. Marcus felt sick. On Halloween night, 1987, he took Sophie, pulled her into that closet when no one was looking. By the time anyone noticed she was missing, he'd already taken her into the vents. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. "Police never found her body," Donald said. "But they found evidence. Blood. Hair. Enough to know she was dead. Cook killed himself before they could arrest him." hanged himself in his apartment, left a note confessing everything. Then why? Why didn't it make the news? Why isn't this public? Donald's smile was bitter. Because the mall owners buried it, paid off the Chin family, threatened the police to keep it quiet. They just invested $40 million in this property. A child murder would have destroyed them. Marcus looked at the crime scene photos, the utility closet, the modified access panel, the dark, narrow vent shaft. So the crying, Marcus said slowly, you think it's Sophie? Her ghost? Donald shook his head. I think it's something worse. Cook didn't just kill Sophie, Donald said. According to his suicide note, he kept her alive in those vents for 3 days. 3 days of her crying, calling for help while he did things to her. Marcus's hands were shaking. By the time she died, Sophie had spent 72 hours in complete darkness, crawling through those ducts trying to find a way out. Crying, screaming, begging for help that never came. That's what soaked into this building, Donald finished. That's what left an imprint. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something worse. An echo. A recording burned into the very metal and concrete of this place. He leaned forward. I've worked here for 37 years, Webb. I've heard the crying probably 1,000 times. And I've seen what happens to people who try to help, who try to find the source. Sophie disappearing was just the first case. Over the years there have been others. Not many. One every few years. Always the same pattern. Someone hears the crying. They investigate. They climb into the vents, or they open an access panel, or they just get too close to the grates. And they vanish. Where do they go? I don't know. Maybe nowhere. Maybe they just stop existing. Or maybe they end up wherever Sophie ended up. Trapped in the echo. Trapped in the recording. Crying in the dark forever. Marcus stared at him. That's insane. Is it? You've been in combat. You've seen what trauma does to places. Buildings where terrible things happen, they feel different, don't they? They hold on to the violence, the fear. Marcus couldn't argue with that. He'd been in villages in Afghanistan where everyone could feel the death in the air. Buildings where massacres had occurred. The atmosphere was different, heavier. This mall, Donald continued, it's built on top of that trauma. Sophie's terror, her suffering, her death, it seeped into everything. And whatever that created, whatever intelligence or presence or force exists in those vents now, it wants company. It wants others to join her in the dark. So the crying is bait. The crying is bait, Donald confirmed. And the only way to survive is to ignore it. To walk away. To let it echo through empty corridors where no one will respond. He closed the folder. That's why the rule exists. That's why you don't investigate. Because the moment you try to help, the moment you reach out to save that crying child, that's when it gets you. Marcus went home that morning with his mind spinning. He didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Sophie Chen's school photo from the police report. A smiling 9-year-old with pigtails and glasses. No idea that in a few months she'd be dead in a ventilation shaft. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Here's where Marcus's military training kicked in. Because Donald's explanation, as horrifying as it was, had holes in it. If the crying was just an echo, a recording, how did it know Marcus's name? How did it move through different sections of the mall? Recordings don't follow people. They don't adapt. They don't learn. And if people had disappeared over the years, where were the police reports? The missing person investigations? Marcus spent his entire day off searching online, going through newspaper archives, checking missing person databases for the Dayton area. Nothing. No unexplained disappearances connected to Westfield Gardens Mall. No janitors or security guards or customers who'd vanished without a trace. Either Donald was lying about the disappearances or something else was going on. Something even darker than what he'd been told. That's when Marcus made his decision. He was going to find out the truth. He was going to find the source of the crying. Even if it killed him. Now, you're probably thinking Marcus was an idiot. And you're right. But here's the thing about people with military training, especially combat medics: they have a hard time walking away from someone in need. It's wired into them at a fundamental level. You run toward the gunfire, not away from it. Marcus had spent years saving lives. The idea that he'd spend the rest of his career ignoring a crying child, even a potentially supernatural one, was unbearable to him. So he started preparing. Marcus spent the next 3 days getting ready. He bought equipment, made plans, studied the mall's layout in detail. From a hardware store he purchased a high-powered LED headlamp, a tactical knife, 50 feet of climbing rope, carabiners, a dust mask, work gloves, and a GoPro camera with a head mount. From a hunting store he bought a GPS tracker, emergency flares, and a satellite communicator, the kind that works even when cell phones don't. He also wrote a detailed letter explaining everything he knew, everything Donald had told him, and his plan to investigate. He sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to his sister in Columbus, and left it on his kitchen counter with instructions to mail it if he didn't return it within 3 days. Then he studied the mall's ventilation schematics. He'd requested them from the building management, claiming he needed them for security purposes. The system was more complex than he'd thought. Hundreds of feet of ducts spreading across 3 floors with multiple connection points and access panels. But there was one area that stood out. One section on the 3rd floor, north wing, where the ducts converged into a larger main shaft. If something was moving through the ventilation system, that's where it would have the most space. That's where it would live. That's where Marcus decided to enter. His plan was simple. On his next shift, when he heard the crying, he would locate the nearest access panel, open it, and climb inside. He'd follow the sound to its source, document everything with the GoPro, and finally get answers. What could go wrong, right? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Marcus's last shift started on October 31st, 2019. Halloween. 32 years to the day after Sophie Chin disappeared. He didn't know if that was coincidence or fate, but it felt significant. Donald wasn't working that night. He'd called in sick, the first time he'd missed a shift in Marcus's 6 weeks there. A replacement supervisor named Janet covered for him, but she spent most of her time in the office doing paperwork. She barely spoke to Marcus. Perfect. Marcus began.